"Shut up! Don't say a word if you still want to live." The words cut through the hush of the pantry like a blade. Grace felt them settle in the small of her back, a cold and steady weight that made the breath at the base of her throat tremble. Only a thin strip of daylight from under the service door carved the floor into a pale line. Beyond that, crystal chandeliers and a world she had scrubbed for years hummed with its own careless light. Grace pressed her hand to the seam of the pantry door and held herself there, listening. On the other side, Evelyn's laugh came soft and controlled, the sort of laugh that cleared a room by claiming its center. Daniel's voice followed, low, practiced, the kind of voice that could make a threat sound like a weather report. "It'll look like age," Daniel said. "A little longer each time. We slow it down. No sudden spikes. Nathan won't see it coming." Evelyn's response was a silk ribbon. "Make sure Grace understands. She knows how to keep things tidy. She's always listening." Grace's fingers tightened until the knuckles whitened. The pantry smelled of lemon oil and old bread, the ordinary sense of a house that lived beneath the glitter. She had learned to find comfort in those smells: soap, coffee, starch. Now they mocked her. She had been careful. She thought she had been invisible, but they had been talking about her. Her first instinct was to run upstairs and warn Nathan, to shove the words, poison, slow, dose, into his ears until he understood. But visibility in Nathan Cole's house was never neutral. It had cost people too much. Silence was a currency here. To be seen was to be debt. To speak could be bankruptcy. She slid back into the shadow of the shelving, heart a steady hammer. For a long minute she remained crouched, counting the irregular beat of her pulse to keep from making an accidental sound. Her work gloves were folded in the pocket of her apron. She kept them there even when she wasn't working, a little habit of someone who had learned to carry tools for survival. The pantry door eased open, soft, careful. And while Evelyn and Daniel's voices trailed away, a man came in to fetch a bottle. Nathan. He moved differently now, slower in the joints, as if invisible hands tugged at him from within. Grace had seen him like that before. Narrowed eyes, the beginnings of a tremor in the hand that once signed checks with theatrical flourishes. She knew his schedule, the corners of his life. The study at 9 for the early calls, lunch with charitable boards, a ritual shave, a different cologne depending on the day. She had been at the house for 8 years. The Cole family had filled her calendar with duties and diminished her presence so gently she had forgotten she occupied a room in anyone's life at all. She cleaned, folded, polished. She noticed things other people didn't notice because she had to. A faint smear on a ledger, a coffee ring on an appointment book, the way Evelyn's necklace ended in the same tiny scrape as the doorknob to the private wing. Things that added up. Now all of that knowledge sharpened into a single, terrible clarity. Nathan paused in the pantry, one hand on a bottle, gaze unfocused. The pantry light painted the side of his face, and Grace saw for the first time the way fear rearranged him. He had always seemed invincible to others, money and influence like armor, but the pauses were real. The cough that cleared his throat after he swallowed was not. He spoke, but the sound was small. "Grace." She didn't answer. She couldn't let him speak, not in that moment. A single word, question, alarm, might bring people rushing in. It might place him where Evelyn and Daniel could reach him and finish what they'd discussed. She had no illusions about what finish meant. He stepped toward the pantry, and Grace stepped further back, the boards cool beneath her shoes. The man in the doorway didn't have the sharpness of youth, but he still carried a presence that made the staff straighten reflexively. She swallowed and moved. When Nathan reached the pantry door, she stepped out without announcing herself. Her apron was heavy with the day's work. She kept her voice small. "Mr. Cole?" she said. The hand on his bottle trembled. He looked at her for a long second, and she met his eyes, not with the obsequiousness he expected, but with something steadier, urgency. He saw the look, and, perhaps because he trusted the people who moved quietly in his household, he followed her suggestion. "Come with me," she said. "Please, just for a moment." He blinked. "Grace, what is it?" He opened his mouth, and then, perhaps because he noticed the way the light lay on her face, the motion of her jaw, the way her hand hovered near the pantry latch, he seemed to understand. She could see the idea forming, ugly as a bruise. He nodded once. "Okay." They moved through service corridors that smelled of starch and lemon and the faint metallic tang of polishing compounds. The world outside, the foyer with its imported rugs, the art that cost more than entire houses, was muffled and distant. In the kitchen, a chef hummed to himself over a sauté pan, oblivious. The house maintained its rhythms even when the gears were being sabotaged. Grace guided Nathan to the maid's quarters instead of his bed. Simple logic. The staff wing was out of the public eye. Fewer cameras, fewer glances, a space where small, life-saving deceptions could go unnoticed. When he stilled in the doorway of her small room, she closed the door softly and leant his weight against the frame. He swayed. "Sit," she told him. Not a command that dared to insult, but an instruction shaped by habit. He sank onto the edge of the narrow bed, palms pressed flat to his knees. Up close, his skin looked translucent. Veins mapped his hands like thin rivers. Grace took from the shelf an old tea tin and a mug. She didn't pretend to be a medic. She could make a cup of tea without invoking the word heal, small practicalities. She cradled warmth between her hands and watched him sip like something sacred. "Who?" he began. "Evelyn and Daniel," she said. She watched his mouth form the names as if testing their weight. "I heard them in the pantry." He laughed then, short and disbelieving, that old billionaire's reflexive dismissal. "They wouldn't." "They would," Grace said. "I heard them say they'd been adjusting things. They said it had looked like natural decline." He turned his face away, the laugh dying as if it had been suddenly deprived of oxygen. "You heard that? Why didn't you tell me before?" "You were well," she said. "You didn't need me then." Her voice sounded small, even to herself. She wished she could make it larger. The room felt too crowded with things that mattered. A chipped photograph of Nathan with a yacht behind him, a box of neatly folded shirts, a clock that ticked with slow patience. For a second she saw the house as it must look to others, pristine, a fortress. To her it felt like a veneer stretched over fragile skin. He reached for her hand. The gesture was clumsy, like someone learning warmth late. "Are you safe?" he asked. Grace inhaled and tasted the iron tang of fear. "Not if I keep my mouth shut," she said. She did not soften the words. They had to be blunt. Silence here was a protection for the protected, not for those who lived by the margins. If she stayed quiet, nothing would change. If she spoke, they would come after her in ways the public could not see. He closed his eyes. For a long time he said nothing. When he finally spoke, there was a hardness in his voice that hadn't been there before. "Then we need proof. Proof." The word hung between them like a vow. It could be a key or a rope. Grace had always kept small inventories in her head, the silent records of the house. Who lingered by the private study, which drawers had spare keys, which envelopes were fed into the shredder at night. Over the years, she had built a stranger's archive of the Cole family's private life, not out of curiosity, but out of proximity. "What if they say you imagined it?" Nathan asked, fear and old skepticism braided together. His hands shook as he set the mug down. "I kept notes," Grace said. She did not always tell people about the leather notebook she carried like a talisman. It was a thin, battered thing, the color of old tea, pages filled with small, precise lines, dates, times, overheard phrases. It was how she remembered the truth when no one else would. "I write down small things, names, times, smells. I started because forgetting felt dangerous." He studied the necklace at her throat, the way her hands never stayed still. Then he nodded. "Good. "Show me." She opened the notebook to a page near the back where the handwriting was tighter, the letters cramped from urgency. There, the pantry conversation, half-heard phrases, the words, adjusting the dose, and scrawled hurriedly, the threat, "If you say a word," as if placing it in ink might make it accountable. Nathan read, and when he finished, he looked up with a different expression altogether. "We can't go to the board blind," he said. "They'll close ranks." Grace had learned the languages of power by the small ways it decided who could live unbothered and who could be erased. Boards closed ranks. Public relations teams tightened statements into neat rectangles of deniability. Police reports could be massaged. Money had a way of translating into silence. "You're right," she said. "We bring counsel. We show them something they can't fold up and put away." They spoke then like people carving a map between them. Time frames, plausible excuses, alibis that could be manufactured. Nathan listened, then heaved as if lifting a burden, and set it down beside him. For the first time in a long while, he sounded less like a man who expected things to go according to plan, and more like someone frightened by his own mortality. "You should go," he told her finally. "Get off the property tonight. Go somewhere no one will think to look." Grace's laugh had no humor. "I'm not leaving." He searched her face as if trying to learn whether a person could be relied on. "I didn't mean—" he started, then stopped. Wealth had made him clumsy with the fragile things of human expectation. "It isn't about me," she said. "It's about what happens if they are allowed to think they can pick away at someone until they're alone." That night, while the house slept under the soft tick of imported clocks, Grace packed a small bag. She gathered the notebook, her phone, an old model she kept offline as a habit of prudence, 2 clean aprons, and a folded sweater. She wrapped the notebook in plastic, not to preserve it from weather, but from the faint damp of rooms people never notice until they're spoiled. Each small act felt like a liturgy, a prayer for survivability. Her home was modest, but hers, one cramped flat above a bakery in a neighborhood where the streetlights knew your name. The smell of baking bread seeped through her window as she opened the door and let Nathan in. He avoided the plush of his own life and sat on her second-hand sofa, a man without his usual crowd of aides and consultants. The simplicity of the apartment was an armor of another kind. She made tea, boiled water in a chipped kettle until it sang. The sound was almost obscene in its ordinariness, soothing, domestic. Nathan watched her hands move with a soldier's focus. "You'll need—" she began, and then stopped herself. The words that could summon lawyers and reports and protection would also invite 100 complications. She had learned to divide life into what she could do and what she must persuade others to do for her. They planned in a whisper. They went over the notes she had taken for months, small irregularities in billing, signatures that looked wrong, a pattern of naturally occurring deaths in people with tenuous outside presence. Grace showed him the ledger, where payments had been redirected to shell accounts, and the thin envelope she had found, slipped between pages of an old magazine, with a hospital label whose handwriting unfurled in a way that didn't match anything else in the house. They decided to retrieve items from the study safe, original documents that could not be faked, and perhaps something more. The study was a room of heavy mahogany, private meetings, and a safe whose lock had the arrogance of those that knew they were trusted. Grace had never been inside the study unaccompanied. No one had expected a maid to need to know its contents. That made it possible. But they did not rush. They needed counsel. Money changed how institutions behaved, but so did the right kind of lawyer. One who would file the right motions, who knew how to request preservation orders without giving away strategy. Crest Harris was the name Nathan remembered hearing in boardrooms, quiet, precise, known for taking on cases that smelled of trouble and handing them light. They called him in the morning. Harris arrived with a leather satchel and a face that did not surprise. He had the practiced neutrality of a man who had seen too much and chosen a career in which facts could be beacons. He listened. He asked the questions that 1,000 cautious people had taught him would matter. Who knew? Who had motive? How could it be proven? Grace watched him from the edge of the room, hands folded in her lap. She did not draw attention to herself, but Harris's eyes flicked to the notebook, and in that glance she saw something shift. He did not ask for the notebook right away. He knew better than to strip a witness of something that made them feel they had been heard. "We'll need originals," Harris said quietly, "paper, unaltered documents, and a recording. If you have someone admitting intent, captured in their own voice, that outweighs a lot." Grace understood the gravity of the sentence, but also the danger. A recording could be the key that swung a door wide, or the spark that made enemies into hunters. "I can get things from the study," she said. The offer trembled on the edge of impossibility. "But I won't become the only thing that stands between them and getting away with it." Harris looked at Nathan then, and Nathan met his gaze like a man measuring the price of things. "You must protect her," Harris said. "The first thing is safe custody. We get a preservation order. We file freezing motions. We make the house less comfortable to tamper with." "How long will that take?" Nathan asked. He sounded like a man who had always had answers the rest of the world deferred to. The new reality seemed unfamiliar and onerous. "It can be fast," Harris said, "but not instantaneous. You need to be prepared to buy time in other ways." Grace could see the calculations forming in the lawyer's head, the rhythm of legal procedure like a skeleton under the flesh of events. Harris's language was careful, not because he didn't care, but because the law demanded it. He spoke of chain of custody, of filing for emergency orders, of evidence preservation. Grace heard the outlines and not the fine print. She trusted him. They planned they would take copies of the ledger and photographs of questionable documents that could be authenticated. Grace would go into the study with Nathan's reluctant assent and retrieve those things no one would think a maid might take. Harris would work the legal channels that kept a resourceful family in check long enough for the truth to get a word in edgewise. Before they moved, Grace did what she always did when fear coiled. She catalogued. She read her own notes aloud, steadying the narrative so others could carry it. "April 17th, she said. "Evelyn, Daniel, and Mr. Cole at study." Evelyn said, "We make it look natural." Daniel said, "A little more each time." They mentioned, "Enough," Nathan interjected. "We have to secure the study." Grace paused, as if letting the words sink in. Secure. It was both a promise and a trap. If they secured the study by legal means, they would have the weight of procedure behind them. If they secured it by stealth, they risked the very exposure that would put them at risk. They chose a middle road. Harris would make the motions to prevent tampering. Grace would move that night to take a handful of things that would be near impossible to dispute in court. Original documents, signatures, a sealed hospital envelope she had seen once, and whatever else the study kept in private drawers. She would not destroy or alter anything. She would not fabricate. She would only collect items that bore evidence of intent. The plan was simple in the way that desperate things are simple. Timing, minimal disruption, plausible deniability. Grace understood that simplicity would be her ally. If something went wrong, it would not be because their strategy was clever. It would be because of the raw violence of what they were trying to stop. That night, the house went about its rehearsed life. Guests arrived for a charity dinner that would glitter with the kind of philanthropy that blurred the edges of guilt. The main floors hummed with the sound of silk and the clink of crystal. In the staff wing, voices grew thin with the weight of secrets. Grace moved like a thread pulled through too many seams. She shed her apron and wrapped her old sweater tight, letting the mundane clothing allow her to dissolve into an ordinary shadow. In the study, the light was low, a single lamp that made halos on the edges of leather-bound volumes. The safe stood behind a desk that smelled faintly of lemon oil and old paper. Locks in houses like this were less for security than ceremony. They signaled who was allowed the key to know what. Grace had never turned the combination before, but Nathan had. He held a certain complacent intimacy with the room that had sheltered his private life. Tonight, he would help her move the things it contained to a place where they could not be rewritten. Her hands were steady as she unlocked cabinets and slid drawers. Papers slid under her fingers like leaves. She looked for anything that felt like proof, names, dates, signatures that did not belong. The shuffle of paper was a delicate sound. She learned the cadence of a house the way she learned the cadence of a child's breathing, by listening. She found a small blue envelope tucked between the pages of a ledger. It had a hospital label and a handwriting that matched several envelopes she'd seen secreted in the privacy of the mansion. Inside were photocopies of notes, a discolored hospital bracelet, and a slip of paper with a name she recognized from her own notebook. She wrapped the items in plastic and slid them into her bag. Then she found the vial. It was not dramatic. It lay in a small cardboard box, wrapped in tissue, the kind of thing a hurried hand might tuck away without thinking. She did not pry the lid or smell it. She closed her eyes and placed it in the satchel with the rest. The vial, the papers, the ledger. They were things that would, in court, speak more plainly than any of them could on their own. On her way out, she paused at the desk and saw a file with a USB label tucked into an organizer. A housekeeping habit. No one would suspect a maid of recognizing a flash drive hiding among a pile of corporate handouts. She slid it into her palm with the same practiced gentleness she used to gather crumbs from a table. Someone might have recorded things for the wrong reasons. Sometimes arrogance produced its own downfall. The drive might hold voices, or it might hold only silence. Either way, it moved to safety. Back in her flat, they laid everything out on a kitchen table and breathed over the small trove like people fearing to wake a sleeping thing. Harris went through it with the measured stare of a man who had seen too many sabotage attempts and too many people convinced a single piece of evidence could topple empires. He took photographs with the methodical patience of someone cataloguing fossils. He advised caution about public exposure. "If you broadcast this now," he said, "you give them reason to bury witnesses or rewrite paper trails. We must move carefully." "How long?" Nathan asked again, the question that seemed to be the hinge of every decision. "Long enough to make their tampering obvious," Harris replied. "Short enough to keep you safe. We file preservation orders at once. We seek emergency protection. We do not announce. We don't let them know we're moving." Grace watched the lawyer's hands, the small controlled gestures he used to give them a path through the chaos. She felt the narrow edge of hope prick at her like a thorn. Hope was dangerous. It made you think an ending could be less costly than it would be. But it was also a tool, and she would not waste it. Late that night, a burner phone vibrated in the pocket of her bag. She didn't answer. The sound died away, a tiny thing in the hollow house. When the phone rang again, Nathan's face had a new hardness. He had not lost the contours of his old certainty entirely. It had been reshaped into something more responsive. He placed a call, and in muffled tones arranged for Harris to file for the preservation orders at first light. There was a flurry of motions, legal steps that would take hours and paperwork, and a long-suffering clerk's compassion. Grace slept for pockets at a time, waking to the creak of the building, listening to the bakery's oven sigh into the morning, cataloguing the sound of their small household. She dreamt briefly of a world in which silence wasn't a weapon. When Harris called to say he'd started the process, the relief that welled in Grace surprised her with its heat. It wasn't victory. It was a delay in the inevitable, a rope thrown across a ravine. The legal world moved with its own gravity, and they had thrown a rock into it and were watching the ripples form. But even as the law began to do what it could, other things stirred in the margins. Word in a house is like dust. If you breathe, it moves. The staff had already begun to rearrange themselves, unconsciously protective, eyes flicking toward the private wing. Nathan's name moved from boardroom to bedroom in the staff gossip, and the palace's machinery adjusted. A gardener who had never before looked at Grace with anything but polite nods began to stand a little straighter when she passed. A housekeeper who had once dismissed her with a shrug left her a folded note that said simply, "Be careful." The note was folded with dexterity. It smelled faintly of starch and the faint floral scent of the house's laundry service. It had the kind of small solidarity that doesn't ask for explanation. Grace kept it in the notebook. Days stretched. Nathan's symptoms waxed and waned. He had flashes of the old man in him, the sharp, impatient executive, followed by tremors and a heaviness that left him silent for hours. Medical appointments were scheduled by way of polite insistence. Harris moved with the secret choreography of a man who knew how to request clinical records be preserved without starting a war. The preservation orders trickled in, paper fences raised to guard the truth from erosion. It wasn't elegant. Justice rarely was. It was methodical. But something else happened too. Evelyn began to change the way she moved through the house. Her smiles became tighter. She reduced the number of people she kept close, and her eyes found Grace more often, as if measuring the maid's courage against the risk of exposure. Daniel's purposeful absence increased. He made business trips with the frequency of someone trying on escape routes. The power of the house, the soft, seamless interchange of influence and oblivion, began to fray at the edges. Grace found that being seen now required a new set of muscles. She had always been careful, but now every glance was a potential hazard, and every confirmed ally a piece of currency. She kept her head down in public and let Nathan be front-facing when they needed someone to be visible. In private, they rehearsed statements, prepared a chronology of events, and crafted a fragile consensus about what it meant to go public. Harris, all business, urged patience. "We don't want the court of public opinion to preempt the court of law," he said, though he knew the press would pry. "Let the evidence build. Let the preservation orders hold. When we move with something that binds them." But Grace couldn't stand still forever. There were nights when she sat awake in her little flat and went over her notes until the handwriting blurred. There were times when she wanted to walk back into that study and take more, to make the truth impossible to ignore. She thought of the words Evelyn had used in the pantry. She thought of the soft, practiced voice that had made a threat sound like a recommendation. "If you say a word, no one will ever find your body," the phrase replayed with a monstrous insistence. Then one afternoon, while Harris was drafting motions and Nathan attended a meeting with the foundation board, Grace found herself alone in the kitchen. The house hummed around her, the kettle singing, the soft clink of porcelain. Within the small hours, she discovered a tape recorder in the drawer where old families kept mementos of speeches and toasts. It was a simple device, unremarkable like the rest of her life. She held it and realized suddenly the terrible advantage of being the person who listens. She did not tell Harris about the recorder. It was unnecessary to do so then. What mattered was the next step. She had something the law would want badly, a way to anchor the abstract to the spoken word. If she could capture the voice that had laid out the plan, she could fix their intent in a way that paper sometimes failed to do. She set small, cunning traps for conversation, little provocations, harmless as dust, that might coax Evelyn or Daniel into the open. She asked about dinner with an innocent curiosity that was, she hoped, the bait. She cleared her throat in hallways. She let her presence be plausible. One night late, while the house slept under the weight of its own polite secrets, a door closed too loudly. Grace, who had been on the landing folding aprons, paused. The study's window drew a thin silver across the hallway floor. Voices, soft, deliberate, passed through the thin walls. She found the recorder in her apron pocket like a talisman and slipped it toward the door with the practiced stealth of a woman who had been told for years to make her life smaller. The conversation was low, like a radio placed between stations. Evelyn's soprano was all control. Daniel's baritone had a flatness that suggested rehearsed cruelty. Grace's mouth went dry. The words hemmed them into a small room where nothing innocent could survive. "We'll need to make it look like a decline," Daniel said, the phrase she'd heard in the pantry now fuller and clearer. "A little longer each time so no one suspects a pattern." Evelyn's answer was a whisper of silk. "We can't be clumsy. Not with his name. Not yet." Grace held her breath. Her hands shook as she fumbled for the small buttons on the recorder. She did not press to record. She had a lawyer who said the weight of recorded evidence mattered as an artifact only when handled rightly. For the first time, the law felt like scaffolding, and the recorder like a fragile plank. She retreated then, back to her quarters, the tape in her hand, the phrase echoing. Her life had narrowed into a single line of duty, to make the truth audible. In the weeks that followed, they moved with the careful violence of people who had no right to fail. Harris filed preservation orders. Photographs of documents were taken and stored. Original papers were slipped into safekeeping in an evidence locker that, for the moment, felt like a small, defiant tomb. Nathan's medical team documented symptoms in ways that could be corroborated. Harris began to whisper to reporters, a careful, unsolicited leak intended to keep the house from developing a monopoly on narrative. Nothing public, nothing theatrical, just enough light to make intent harder to hide in shadow. They considered the gala a glittering night where the coals would be toasted for their philanthropy and their names would be spoken into the comfortable mouths of the city's elite. A place where Evelyn felt particularly at home. A place where confession is seldom expected. The idea hovered in the room like a challenge. Could truth be made to speak louder than the clink of champagne flutes? It would be easy to say no. It would be easy to let the legal system grind on, to let forms and filings do their work. But there was a moral logic to publicness in their situation. Silence had protected those who abused their power for too long. Sometimes the public needed a jolt, an undeniable moment when the thing hiding behind posh facades lost its capacity to perform innocence. Harris, cautious and precise, recommended patience. "We don't rush spectacles," he said, "but you can decide who will speak when the time comes. Control the narrative as best you can." Nathan looked at Grace then and saw something he had not seen before. Not just a maid or an employee, but someone who had carried the burden of evidence, of listening, of existing quietly in rooms where a wrong sound could get you erased. His expression bore the distance of a man realizing what invisibility had cost her. "You planned this," he said. "It wasn't a plan," she answered. "It was paying attention." He swallowed. "Then you'll be the one to decide how loud we go," he said. "I won't stand at the podium and bat my hands while you hold the rope." They argued in soft ways about who would stand where, what could be shown without endangering the chain of custody, how to protect witnesses. Harris advised sealed transmissions, counsel in the wings, reserve ambulances without fanfare. It was a choreography of safety and exposure. Grace thought about the cost. Speaking had always had a price tag in the corridors she inhabited. It might cost her safety or sleep or the capacity to pass unnoticed in a city that preferred its servants silent. But the alternative had a different cost. Nathan dead, the household's abuses folded into typographies of old money. The day before the gala, Nathan insisted on coming by her flat. He'd been advised not to be alone in public, but he wanted to check, one more time, that what they were about to attempt had a backbone. He brought no assistance, only a satchel and a look that had the brittle quality of someone learning to participate without dominating. He sat in her small kitchen and took a breath like a man about to speak at length. "I've always believed that if you give someone enough money, they'd be spared some sorts of ugliness," he said. "I never understood you people. I thought money could answer everything." Grace looked at him, listening to the confession that wealth had never been able to purchase immunity from the small cruelties people practiced close to home. "It can buy comfort," she said. "It can't buy conscience." He smiled then, a tight, surprised thing. "Then teach me how," he said. Their plan crystallized in a few sentences then. Grace would return to the house as staff for the gala. She would be invisible among the invisible, moving plates and clearing glasses, carrying the evidence in a place where it could be revealed without the opportunity to hide it. Harris would be the one to signal when to move. Nathan would be visible and would play his part. But the truth would be the weapon. They would not shout it from rooftops. They would let it speak in a place where the elite felt untouchable. If they could not be convinced, then the law would have to follow with its slow, grinding machinery. They rehearsed roles with a tender gravity, assigning exits and backup plans as if mapping a small theatre. Grace found it strange that choreography so intimate would be necessary to save a life. She had grown up with the idea that the world would tell her where to stand. Now she was choosing. On the night of the gala, the house shimmered. The main rooms bathed in the loud, polished joy of the city's philanthropic glitter. Music swelled like a tide. Grace slipped into a uniform that made her part of the wallpaper. Black skirt, crisp blouse, hair tied back. She pinned the evidence in a place so small only she knew, a place where buttons and folds would hide what mattered. Nathan stood near the dais, speaking to a crowd whose applause felt like the sound of people congratulating themselves for being generous. Grace moved through the room with the slow patience of someone who had mastered the art of being unseen, and chose now to be seen only in service of the truth. The music rose, the clink of glasses punctuated speeches, and for a heartbeat, the whole room felt like it could go on forever in its comfortable denial. She glanced toward the dais and saw Evelyn smiling in the way practiced smiles are. The necklace at her throat caught light and threw it back like currency. Daniel laughed at a joke someone told. His hand rested near a glass. The world seemed to hold its breath. Grace's heart hammered. Her palms were slick. She felt for a moment the full cruelty of the pantry's threat behind her eyes. If she spoke wrong, if she exposed too early, the machinery of defense around the coals might grind down anyone who moved against them. She thought of the note tucked into her apron, of Harris's dry warnings, of Nathan's slow, careful insistence that this had to be done correctly. She stepped toward the corner where a tall fern shielded a service entrance and felt the weight of everything she'd carried accumulate in her chest. The music swelled and dimmed, as if the room itself were a lung. She placed the recorder in the hollow between some napkin holders, as if tucking a sleeping child under a blanket. She set her jaw and let her expression be the indifferent face of work. When the time came, when Nathan's speech reached the polite applause and the room's attention had narrowed into a single knot, the hush would have to break in a way that even the chandeliers couldn't smooth over. Grace felt the weight of the room settle on her shoulders like heat. She moved with the practiced economy of someone who knows how to be everywhere yet unseen. A cleared plate here, a napkin straightened there, a polite smile when eyes brushed her. The recorder lay small and secret in its hollow. The flash drive, smaller than a thumbnail, sat in the seam of her apron where only she knew to feel for it. Each breath she drew sounded too loud. Nathan's voice rose to the part of the speech that thanked donors and catalogued accomplishments. It was the sort of litany that made people comfortable. Numbers, programs, the soft absolution of philanthropy. His tone shifted then, unplanned, raw. He veered from prepared lines, and Grace's stomach knotted as he began to speak in a cadence that felt like an admission. "Evelyn," he said, and the name struck like a thrown glass. Heads turned. Evelyn's smile trembled. Daniel's jaw tightened. Across the room, Crest Harris watched with the cold, collected attention of a man waiting for evidence to do its work. He gave no visible sign to the security staff clustered near the back, men and women who, to the room, were simply part of the evening's machinery. He had arranged for a subtle amplification. The gala's soundboard was connected to a laptop under the dais, and Harris's assistant had slipped an audio file in the feed. It would play when Nathan reached the line they had agreed upon. Grace felt a sudden private terror. All of it depended on tiny mechanisms, human and mechanical, holding steady. She thought of the pantry and its thin strip of light. She thought of the phrase that had set her life on its current course. "If you say a word, no one will ever find your body." The memory made her palms clammy. She had decided months ago that threats carried the weight they sought only if met with silence. Nathan paused, and the crowd obligingly applauded the pause, as if it were meant to be part of the performance. He looked at her for a moment. No words, just an acknowledgement that she existed in a different register than the gilded faces around them. Then he leaned toward the microphone and began to speak the short sentence Harris had written into his script. "I have something I need to share." The applause that followed was cautious. Nathan's voice, at first steady, faltered a beat, and then the speakers took over. A sound folded into the room. The recording. For a heartbeat, it was only ambience, a low murmur that could have been a rehearsal. Then, in Evelyn's voice, the voice people used to smooth decisions into place, came the sentence Grace had heard in the pantry, clearer, without irony. "We make it look like a decline. A little longer each time." There was a beat. The orchestra's strings seemed to hold their breath. Silverware stopped moving. Somewhere in the back, a glass tipped, and someone made a small sound, like a swallowed curse. Evelyn blinked, as if she hadn't expected to hear herself. Her face, always rehearsed for generosity, folded into something thinner. Daniel's mouth went dry. People began to murmur. A uniformed clerk at the edge of the room straightened and reached subtly for his phone. Grace felt the room tilt. The recording was not a revelation in the sense of a crime scene. It was, rather, a profound exposure of intention. Intent is the thing the law most hungrily seeks, what someone meant to do, spoken aloud. Here it was, in a room full of patrons who had trusted their reputations to curated public personae. A woman near the stage whispered, "Is that—" Harris let the sound swell. He had prepared for the recording's obvious assault on denial. He had prepared, too, for the possibility that some would cry foul, accusations of editing, of manipulation. That line of defense was predictable. Worse, it was the sort of public argument that could be manufactured and sustained by money and lawyers. "What about the documents?" someone hissed, 2 rows back. Grace took a breath and felt a small, steadying flame of resolve. At that moment, Nathan, no longer the remote titan of boardrooms, but a man with an alarmed face and hands that trembled, set his palm against the podium. "There is more," he said, his voice stripped of pretense. "And I have them." He did not shout. That was not the point. He held up the smallest of things, a flash drive between 2 fingers, as modest as a mint. For a breath, the device looked almost absurd in that glittering room full of wealth and self-regard. Then he placed it on the podium, and with a motion that seemed both ceremonial and terrified, slid it toward the center. Grace had planned for chaos, but not for the exact contours of it. The room reacted the way large bodies do when suddenly recalibrating their weight. A rustle of coats, a murmur like wind through trees. Evelyn rose as if to intercept, but the microphone and the feed were out of her reach. Harris had ensured that the chain of events could not be casually rewound. "You can't do this," Evelyn said, her voice thin, practiced urgency, trying to stitch the evening back together. "Nathan, please." "People deserve to hear what I didn't want to hear," Nathan replied. His face was pale, the tremor under his skin more noticeable now. "I don't want to make a spectacle. I want them to hear the truth." There was resistance. A PR consultant near Evelyn mouthed a plea. Reporters in the gallery leaned forward like predators. A board member's face went slate. He mouthed, "Stop." The recording played again, and this time it included a line from Daniel. "We finish slowly. No sudden moves." The words, plain as bone, were enough for some. For others, disbelief generated a new kind of self-protective logic. Perhaps the recording had been taken out of context. Perhaps it was a ploy. That was when Harris stood and, with a lawyer's calm, addressed the audience not as a theatre but as a tribunal. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, voice smooth, "we understand the gravity of what's been heard. For the sake of clarity and safety, we ask that you remain in your places while authorities are notified. We are presenting evidence to law enforcement." The security team began to work quietly, cordoning off the dais, guiding servers away, ensuring exits. A man at the edge of the floor, one of the gala's hired security, reached for his radio. He had no warrant, no official badge to show the crowd, but he had been briefed by an agent Harris had contacted earlier when the preservation orders began to take effect. Harris had asked for a discreet presence. The DA had obliged by having a unit on standby, not to make a spectacle, but to be ready should the public reveal cross the line into probable cause. In the half-minute that followed, the room contracted into a different kind of geometry. Some leaned toward the scandal, like moths to light. Others retreated, lips sealed and faces blank. Evelyn and Daniel looked like actors whose scripts had been stolen mid-performance. Then Nathan's knees buckled. It was not cinematic. There was no dramatic swoon. His hand came to his chest and his fingers trembled. Then he tipped forward as if gravity had suddenly found new permission. Someone behind him caught his arm. The gasp that broke from the crowd was like a drumbeat. Grace moved without thought. Years of knowing the house's hidden roots, and who would and would not notice, pushed her through the current of bodies. She was at his side before anyone had labeled what had happened. His face was grey. His breaths came shallow. "Call for medics!" someone shouted, and the room fractured into urgent noises. Radios scratched, phones rang, someone ordered doors locked. Protocols meant to keep sensation from spilling into the night. Paramedics arrived with efficient, dry professionalism. They worked around the dazzle without being dazzled. One of them, calm, competent, checked Nathan and spoke short sentences the way people speak to each other in crisis. Count the breaths. Check responsiveness. Move him gently. He told someone to secure the flash drive as a potential piece of evidence. Harris, already moving in legal thinking, made sure the drive was placed in a sealed envelope and handed it to a uniformed officer who had finally been cleared to approach. Word traveled faster than the full sequence. The recording had been played. Nathan had fainted. Phones were out. A reporter close to the staff posted the first thread. Within 10 minutes, a cluster of journalists were outside the house, their cars casting surgeon lights against the gravel. The gala dissolved into a net of whispers and small strategic movements. People shielding names, others stepping forward to claim ignorance. The medical team loaded Nathan into an ambulance with an efficiency that left little room for entitlement. Grace climbed into the vehicle with him when Harris insisted she go. She'd been the one there. She was the witness closest to him when he had gone pale. For the first time she rode an ambulance in one of the city's uniforms, the lights painting the inside of the van with blue. At the hospital, the staff moved through standard triage and investigation. Nathan was taken to emergency, where he was stabilized. His condition would require observation and tests. Harris stayed in the waiting area, arranging for Nathan's records to be preserved, for the flash drive and the documents Grace had brought to be secured by an evidence tech. The DA's office, alerted by Harris, sent an investigator to begin the process of gathering probable cause statements. Protocols that had seemed bureaucratic in previous conversations now mattered like scaffolding. The DA assigned a team with jurisdiction and the capacity to act quickly because of the recording's sudden public airing and the visible medical emergency. They applied for emergency search authority for the mansion, preserved orders already in place, made the process faster, and requested immediate preservation of surveillance footage. It was not instantaneous justice. It was the law moving along its designed tracks at a speed made possible by good counsel and the sudden, irrefutable nature of the public evidence. The request was measured, legally framed, not the stuff of television. It was enough to justify officers entering the house to secure evidence and detain persons of interest for questioning. At the mansion, Detective Freeman, a man with a permanent crease of suspicion on his face, walked through rooms he had once walked through with a different stance. He had been the sort of cop who sheltered the comfortable in vague ways. Tonight, forced into a role his habits had never quite prepared him for, he registered the severity of the allegations and the weight of the public scene. He moved to secure the safe, to inventory the items Grace had removed earlier and had now placed in safekeeping. His hands were careful. He read documents with the air of someone who had suddenly found a moral compass sharp enough to cut through good linens. Evelyn and Daniel were questioned in separate rooms. The DA's office coordinated. At first, defensive strategies unfurled, claims of selective editing, assertions that the recording had been manipulated. That is a common defense when words, rather than physical acts, become the hinge of a case. The DA replied with the steps Harris had taken: preservation orders, a sealed chain of custody for the flash drive, and corroborating documents from the mansion that Tracy had catalogued. They also had medical timing that suggested Nathan's symptoms aligned with the pattern Grace had described. Over the next days, the investigation grew like a slow, inevitable tide. Toxicology would confirm the presence of substances in Nathan's bloodstream, inconsistent with his prescriptions. The wording would be careful in reports, traces of a compound linked to neurological decline. A phrasing that avoided specifics but was damning in the context of the recording and the documents. For the family, the public unraveling felt like a private apocalypse. For Grace, it was a series of moments, the reading of a report, the questioning of staff who had been instructed sometimes to deny, sometimes to look away. She watched faces shift, a soft palette of guilt and relief. Harris prepared the emergency filings, requests for protective custody for Grace, motions to keep evidence sealed, and a careful notification to the board of the foundation to keep the corporate structure from hiding the personal allegations. He coached Grace on giving statements, factual, concise, refraining from speculation. He warned her of cross-examination and taught her to let memory be her ally rather than rhetoric. She practiced saying dates, names, times, and the exact words she had written down. The press swirled. At first, there were opportunistic headlines that delighted in the spectacle. Then, beneath the flash, the facts mattered. Reporters began to check records and found the ledgers Grace had flagged, the redirected payments that had been catalogued, and the hospital envelope she had rescued from the study. The press, oddly, turned from predator to corroborator. Their digging yielded other details the DA could use. A few staff members who had once been wary suddenly offered to talk. They had seen inconsistencies and now had a vehicle to voice them without being the only voice. Under oath, their statements fleshed out the private life of the mansion, who had had access to what rooms, which schedules were irregular, small items disposed of in odd ways. No single testimony was cinematic. Together, Stitched by corroboration and paper trails and the recording, they formed a tapestry that the DA's office could present as probable cause. Evelyn and Daniel were arrested after a hearing in which the judge, presented with the recording, the flash drive, the documents Grace had produced and the medical reports, found sufficient probable cause to detain them pending indictment. The news travelled like an aftershock. Social columns were stunned. The Foundation's board announced a temporary suspension of roles. The Coles Circle, which had once seemed impermeable to accusation, now watched as law exerted the slow but tangible force of consequence. In the weeks that followed, the case moved through the proper channels. Investigators worked with forensic audio analysts to examine the recording's authenticity. The analysis confirmed no sign of tampering beyond normal background noise. Chain of custody for the drive and the documents was documented in photograph and affidavit. Toxicology confirmed that Nathan had been exposed to compounds inconsistent with prescribed medication, sufficient to cause his symptoms. Witnesses' statements lined up in chronology. At the arraignment, Evelyn and Daniel entered the courtroom with attorney entourages. Their defense began the predictable choreography: plead not guilty, attack the evidence's reliability, and suggest alternative explanations. Harris, who had by now become an indispensable quiet force, coordinated with the DA to present a case that leaned on the unremarkable but effective legal engine of corroboration: voice recording, documents, medical reports, and consistent testimony. The strength of the prosecution lay not in drama, but in the slow, machine-like convergence of different proof forms. During the pre-trial motion hearings, Grace was placed in protective custody, simple, practical steps to keep witnesses safe. She was given a small apartment and an escort when necessary. The protective measures were bureaucratic and prosaic. They were also life-preserving. She resented the loss of the small freedoms she had cherished, but she understood the logic. The trial itself, when it began, was not a single altar of passion. It was a sequence of testimonies and exhibits, careful, exacting, the sort of legal work that resists sensationalism. The recording played in court. This time the audio technicians testified to its provenance, the chain of custody, the context in which it was captured. Medical experts spoke in measured terms about the effects of the substances found in Nathan's system without naming methods. Forensic accountants traced payments and showed how certain accounts had been diverted in ways consistent with a pattern of concealment. House staff testified to small patterns of behavior: the way certain doors were locked at odd hours, the shifts in medication schedules. Each witness sharpened the picture. The defense tried to challenge Grace. The cross-examination was clinical. Questions about when she first noticed things, whether she had motive, whether she had ever been treated unfairly in the house. Grace answered with the same plain, unadorned sentences she had used in the maid's quarters and the kitchen. A few times her voice shook. No one was surprised to learn that fear was still a part of her cadence. But her testimony did what it needed to do. It placed words in time and positioned them alongside the recording and the documents that corroborated her account. Nathan testified as well. His transformation from aloof donor to vulnerable human being notable to those in the courtroom. He spoke with humility about the ugliness shown in his own home, and with an insistence that he had been too complacent for too long. He confessed to trusting the wrong people and to not listening when those who cared for him tried to raise alarms. In his testimony, he did not attempt to command pity. He offered an account of someone learning painful accountability. The jury deliberated. Outside, opinion pieces debated the morality of old money and its susceptibility to private violence. Inside, for 12 hours and then 16, the jurors parceled through testimony, weighed the recording's authenticity, the document's provenance, and the medical evidence that suggested a pattern of deliberate harm. When they returned, the verdict cut through the polished veneers of the Coles' public life. Guilty. The words landed like stones. Evelyn and Daniel Cole were found guilty of charges that included conspiracy to commit bodily harm and tampering with a vulnerable adult, formal charges that acknowledged not only a deed but an attempted erasure. The judge's sentencing was sober, reflecting the gravity of harm and the breach of trust. The law, for all its slowness and carefulness, had made a statement. Those who hide cruelty behind silk and glass can be held responsible. Nathan's recovery was neither instant nor total. He gained strength slowly. The symptoms that had once forced him to pause in the pantry receded with careful medical attention. Some things that had been lost returned, while others required adaptation. He sued for negligence and settled some claims that restructured the foundation's governance. Publicly, he expressed shame and a commitment to change. Behind closed doors, he wrote the checks he had never wanted to write in the form of reparative funds, medical expenses, and a foundation earmarked for domestic workers' protections. It was not absolution. It was an attempt to correct. Grace's life changed in ways she had not asked for. Her name no longer fit comfortably on the margins. She was hailed in certain circles, resented in others. There were moments when a public microphone asked for her to speak about courage and moral witnessing, and she often refused. Public attention, she had learned, is a double-edged thing. But she accepted a quieter, steadier role. With Nathan's support and Harris's continued guidance, she helped found a small non-profit aimed at protecting domestic workers, teaching documentation, worker rights, and how to preserve evidence without risking safety. The center's classes were plain and practical: how to keep a careful ledger, how to make a note with time and place, how to seek legal counsel. The center provided a hotline that connected staff to pro bono lawyers and offered emergency housing resources. Grace led classes with the same precise economy she had always shown. "Write dates as you live them," she would tell a crowded room. "Not later, not when memory becomes unreliable. Get it while it is small." Her voice, once acquiescent, carried the kind of authority that comes from having held truth under the hardest lights and refused to let it be swallowed. There were difficult adjustments. Some former colleagues were wary of re-entering houses owned by the wealthy. Public scandals had consequences for livelihoods. Grace and her organization worked with funders, including Nathan's revised foundation, to create a safety net. Short-term financial aid for domestic workers who lost jobs after whistleblowing, legal representation funds, and a small emergency shelter where the threatened could wait while authorities processed their complaints. The message she taught was basic, but sharp. Listening matters, documentation matters, and speaking is an act of courage that must be supported by systems. She organized workshops, held a line outside shelters where women and men could deposit narrations into envelopes, and insisted on teaching staff how to make their observations useful for legal processes without placing themselves in greater danger. She did not teach people to be activists in the way campaign ads speak of it. She taught them to be small guardians of their own truths. Nathan's role, too, evolved. He used his resources not to control, but to create structures: funds that paid legal fees, trusteeships that included worker representatives, and a board that now included caregivers and advocates. He spoke publicly, sometimes clumsy in his acknowledgement of what had happened under his roof, sometimes eloquent in his promise to do better. The work was messy. There were board fights and PR missteps, and the slow, constant task of dismantling systems built across generations. But his presence helped seed the kind of institutional change that never needs new headlines to take root. Grace's community responded with a cautious warmth. People she had once passed on the street now saw her in a different light. A neighbor left a loaf of bread on her stoop after the trial, with a small note that read, "You spoke, and we are safer." She kept the note in the front of her notebook. Years later, the non-profit had a small office on a narrow street. It was not glamorous, it was practical, with a coffee pot that sang and a wall of indices and testimonials. Grace's classes had expanded to include a legal clinic staffed by volunteer lawyers and a rotating set of educators who taught workers how to prepare statements, preserve documents, and, crucially, how to find solidarity. On the anniversary of the trial's verdict, Nathan visited quietly. He arrived with a modest gift, a scholarship fund in Grace's name to sponsor domestic workers seeking legal education. He had given up a number of his public speaking slots, but had doubled down on the less visible work. Endowments, governance reform, quietly funding organizations that prevented the kind of isolation that had allowed harm to happen in his home. They sat in a small kitchen at the non-profit's office, the room smelling faintly of coffee and paper. Outside, a street vendor called numbers. Inside, the tinny radio hummed a low background. "Did you ever imagine you could stand and not be unheard?" Nathan asked, his voice softer than it had been months before. Grace looked at the tiny scholarship certificate he had pushed across the table. She uncapped a pen and underlined the name of the first recipient. "I've always been heard," she said, "but sometimes hearing isn't the same as being believed." They smiled in the careful way adults do when acknowledging fault and learning. The work they had done had not erased the cost, the nights of fear, the small betrayals, the people who refused to change, but it had created a different horizon for those who came after. The city, which loves progress as a headline, absorbed the cold case into its long memory. Some dinners mentioned it in the same breath as scandal. Others used it as an example of the necessity for reform. In a small, enduring way, a few policies shifted. Preservation orders became more known among advocacy networks. Legal clinics received more funding. Domestic workers took a seat at tables that had once spoken for them. Grace continued her routine in small ways, cleaning, noting, keeping the habit of precise observation alive. But she also kept a journal where she recorded more than errands and overheard phrases. She wrote of the quiet things that mattered. The way a neighbor's child learned to whistle, the slow repair of a cup's chipped rim, the first time one of her students reported a problem and was believed. On a late afternoon, years after the pantry's thin strip of light, she stood in the doorway of a community room where a new class had gathered. The room smelled at once of detergent and possibility. A banner on the wall bore the non-profit's modest logo. Students filed in, some careful, some brimming with the raw pride of someone finally being taught how to hold their own story with care. "Welcome," she said, and the room leaned toward her voice as if toward a hearth. "If you've ever heard something that didn't seem right, this is the place to learn how to use that listening, not to be heroes but to protect one another." She started the lesson with a simple sentence she had once whispered in a pantry and now used in a very different register. Small things add up. Outside, the city moved on. The coals faded from the social pages and into the footnotes of reform. Evelyn and Daniel served sentences. Their names floated as cautionary tales at certain elite dinners. Nathan, diminished in some ways and expanded in others, continued to fund work that made being a domestic worker less solitary and less dangerous. Grace's warning that silence could be a death sentence remained at the core of what she taught, but it was balanced with a new truth she had learned. Speaking is risky, but it is also the seed of structure. When a person speaks and someone listens, when the law leans in and the community holds space, small acts of courage can catalyze institutional responses. Years after that night, she walked past the place where she had once stood in the pantry. The house had new owners. The stillness of the entrance made her think of how fragile privacy can be. She fingered the note still tucked in the notebook, the one that said simply, "Be careful." She folded it back into place and kept walking. If this scene gripped you, tap like. Someone who needs to hear a story about listening might see it. The rest of her life was ordinary in many ways. She mended shirts, kept neat ledgers, taught, counseled, and occasionally testified in courtrooms where other small understandings needed amplification. She saw the human cost of exposure, people who had been brave and now had to live with the fallout of that bravado. She also saw what could be done when power was met with coordinated and careful response. On quiet nights, Nathan would visit the community center and sit in a chair at the back. He never announced himself. He would listen as Grace led a class and then walk out again, leaving applause to the group. There was humility in his presence that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with privacy and atonement. The non-profit slowly became a place of refuge and education. Its impact could not be reduced to headlines. It changed laws in small jurisdictions, supported reforms at social service agencies, and perhaps most importantly, taught people that the act of listening was not a private indulgence, but a civic duty. In the end, Grace's story was not merely about a maid who overheard a terrible thing and chose to speak. It was about the cumulative power of ordinary acts, the keeping of notes, the choosing to call a lawyer, the decision to place evidence where it could be found, and the willingness of one man to use his resources not to escape accountability, but to support those he had harmed by omission. It was about the cost of silence and the hard work of turning attention into protection. She kept the notebook, now thicker with other people's notes, testimonies, and lesson plans. On the front page she had written, in an unadorned hand, a line she had once read aloud to a room full of people frightened by the idea of telling the truth. "If you hear something that matters, make a record. Let the world know you heard it." When she closed the book, the world did not feel fixed. There were always new cases, new ambiguities, new people who feared speaking, but there were also, by then, more places to go, more lawyers to call, and more people willing to listen. Grace had become, in the quietest way, a conduit. The city had learned that the sound that could break a chandelier's shimmer into shards was a voice being believed. And though she never sought a spotlight, her life, rooted in small domestic rituals, had become a platform for a steadier kind of justice. If this story moved you, share it and tell us where you're watching from.